One of the characteristics of Saddam is that he didn't mind killing.
He read about Hitler, about Stalin, about the mafia.
He has a certain animal cunning, there's no doubt about it.
He said himself that if I get suspicion about a person, I kill him. His only political vision is to be a president of Iraq, not to serve the Iraqis, but to serve himself and his two sons.
And now the former dictator of Iraq will face the justice he denied to millions.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
On the night of December 13th, 2003, Saddam Hussein, one of the most wanted men in the world, was finally in American hands.
At around 8:30 p.m. Baghdad time, United States military forces captured Saddam Hussein alive. He was found near a farmhouse outside the city of Tikrit in a swift raid conducted without casualties.
It was an unbelievable moment, made more incredible by the way Saddam looked. Photographed here as an American doctor examined him, Saddam was bearded, disheveled, a shell of the immaculate and commanding Saddam, who for years had menaced the world. They'd found him, literally, in a hole in the ground, just yards from one of the opulent palaces where he'd lived when he was in power. The former dictator surrendered meekly, without a fight.
He was just very much bewildered, and then he was taken away. There was no resistance of any sort.
When word spread that Saddam had been caught, there were joyous celebrations in the streets of Baghdad. The joy was so great because life under his regime had been so oppressive. Saddam, who was obsessed with his legacy, once told his official biographer he wasn't interested in what people think of him now, only what they will think of him in 500 years. Now history will write his epitaph.
In the Hall of Fame of major despots of history, Saddam Hussein will occupy a proud place, perhaps a different vision than that which he wanted to see for himself in a place in history.
Saddam Hussein was born here, in the cradle of civilization. His family came from a tiny mud and straw village called Al-Auja, in the land of ancient Babylon in central Iraq.
Most of his relative, they are tough people. They killed each other. Some of them are thieves.
Most families lived in miserable poverty, but Saddam Hussein was born into the unhappiest of homes. Before he was even born, Saddam's mother tried to kill herself and him. Suba Talfa was 7 months pregnant when she lost her husband. Then a son fell fatally ill and died.
Now here is this widow, pregnant. She said, I don't want this child. What good will the child do to me? I lost my husband, I lost my other child. And she even said that this child from her belly is actually getting rid of competitors. He wants to be the only man in the family. And she was trying to bang her belly against the door and against walls, but eventually she gave birth.
The child was born on April 28, 1937. His mother called him Saddam, which means in Arabic, the one who confronts. With no means to support herself, much less a son, Saddam's mother sent him away to live with her brother, Khairallah, in nearby Tikrit, on the banks of the river Tigris. Saddam spent his first 4 years in the care of his uncle Khairallah, who, as a military officer, had some status in the village. His son Adnan became Saddam's best friend. In 1941, Khairallah, a rabid nationalist, joined a Nazi-backed revolt against the British forces who were then occupying Iraq. The revolt was crushed by the British. For his part in the failed insurrection, Khairallah was stripped of his commission and jailed. Saddam was returned to his mother's care. She had remarried her late husband's brother, a local tough known as Hassan the Liar.
He was apparently quite brutal towards young Saddam, both physically and psychologically.
The wicked stepfather beat and abused the boy. He wouldn't let Saddam go to school, insisting instead that Saddam make himself useful by stealing goats and chickens. If he was caught, Saddam was known for poisoning or killing the animal, rather than giving it back. When he was 10, Saddam heard that his uncle Khairallah had been freed from jail. One night, he stole away to live with his uncle.
His maternal uncle filled him with dreams of glory, told him he had a special role to play in Iraqi history, told him of the great heroes of Iraq with whom he identified young Saddam.
Saddam was finally allowed to go to school, but he learned more than how to spell his name while under his uncle's roof. Khairallah gave him his first real possession at age 10, a gun. He also taught him how to use it.
He used to have a gun when he was in the primary school, and he threatened the teachers by gun. And it is said that he killed, when he was 10 years old, he killed a person.
The police arrived at his house within an hour of the murder to find young Saddam sound asleep, the gun under his pillow, still warm. In 1956, Uncle Khairallah took Saddam away from backwater Tikrit, 100 miles down the Tigris, to the legendary city of Baghdad.
He immediately joined the most active, radical, and burning, so to say, party in Iraq, and that was the Ba'ath Party. It was a young, radical, dashing, very extreme nationalistic, and slightly socialistic.
Saddam Hussein was a young hitman. One of the characteristics of Saddam is that he didn't mind killing.
In 1959, the Ba'ath Party gave Saddam his big break. He was chosen to be part of a team to assassinate Iraq's new military ruler, General Qasim. The plan was to ambush Qasim's car in broad daylight on Baghdad's busiest avenue, Rashid Street.
Because they didn't know how to prepare an ambush, they shot at each other. They also wounded the general, didn't kill him. But Saddam himself was wounded by a bullet, apparently from one of his own comrades.
Qasim escaped to show off his bullet-ridden limousine. The hit squad fled to a safe house, and even though the attack was a failure, the incident soon acquired legendary status and was dramatized for Iraqi TV. At only 22, Saddam was now one of Iraq's most wanted men. After the attack, he escaped home to Tikrit, and from there crossed the desert disguised as a Bedouin tribesman. Then he made his journey to the center of the Arab world, Cairo, where he would learn some valuable lessons about power while he plotted his return to Iraq. After a daring escape from Iraq in 1960, Saddam Hussein arrived in the most exciting city in the Arab world, Cairo. Saddam enrolled in Cairo University's law school and for 3 years lived as a political exile in Egypt, making contacts in the local Ba'ath Party. But mainly, he was just waiting to get home. On February 11, 1963, a coup in Baghdad toppled General Qasim and brought Saddam's Ba'ath Party to power in Iraq.
And immediately Saddam Hussein moved to Baghdad, where he served as one of the new regime's hitmen, and middle-level organizers.
Now that he was home, Saddam could also take a bride. His grandmother arranged a marriage to his cousin Sajida, the daughter of his uncle and mentor, Khairallah. But by the end of the year, yet another coup forced the Ba'ath Party back out of power. In 1964, the Ba'ath leadership recruited Saddam for another assassination attempt against the new president of Iraq. The plan was betrayed, and a warrant was put out for Saddam's arrest. This time he chose not to flee, but to face prison in Iraq. In his 2 years in prison, Saddam plotted his party's return to power and read up on his role models.
He read about Hitler, about Stalin, about the mafia, about the dictatorship in history, and I think he took few from them, from each, to collect all the bad things in himself.
In 1966, Saddam escaped from prison with the help of sympathetic prison guards. Saddam went back to work in Baghdad, quietly making a name for himself as an activist in the underground Ba'ath Party opposition.
He has a powerful personality, charisma. You feel that, and the ability to convince others, and you feel you feel that you are in the presence of a real leader.
On July 17, 1968, Saddam enlisted the help of a corps of disgruntled army officers in a coup that put his Ba'ath Party back into power and put his cousin, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, in charge. Saddam quickly found his niche in the new regime as Bakr's deputy and head of his secret police, the Mukhabarat.
Saddam was a hatchet man of the regime. There was a division of labor always between al-Bakr and Saddam. Saddam was the man who always did the dirty work of the regime.
3 months after coming to power, Saddam and Bakr organized a grisly celebration of their new regime. They declared a national holiday for the public execution of a circle of alleged spies, most of them Iraqi Jews.
And they made a very public spectacle of their execution. Hundreds of thousands of people were actually brought in from the villages, trapped in carnival-like atmosphere as 13 bodies dangled in the air in Central Liberation Square.
Though Bakr was still president in name, Saddam was increasingly the strongman, the real power behind the scenes. In 1972, Saddam nationalized the Iraq Petroleum Company, which controlled 15% of the world's oil. He used the money to finance a great leap of development, modernizing villages and cities and bringing Iraq into the 20th century.
Part of Saddam's mystique, if you might call it that, is what he actually achieved for the country. This man electrified virtually every village in Iraq. He built road systems like nobody built roads before in Iraq.
Then Saddam made his move to the top.
The president of Iraq, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, said he was resigning today because of poor health. He handed over power to the military strongman, General Saddam Hussein, who for some time has been regarded as Iraq's real head of government.
Saddam consolidated his grip on power by calling an unusual meeting 5 days later, which he ordered cameras to record for posterity. This rarely seen footage shows the mystified party leaders hearing Saddam announce that he had uncovered yet another plot against the government, and that some of the conspirators were in the audience. An alleged informant took the podium and began reading off the names of the plotters. As each name was read out, a man was hustled out by the secret police. The tension mounted among those remaining as the list of conspirators grew.
Nobody knew whose name would appear next. So you can imagine 250 of the most senior people in Iraq sitting in this hall, dying inside, waiting to see whether their name is mentioned too, because they knew that once their name is mentioned, they're dead.
The remaining leaders sweated. Only Saddam seemed to be enjoying his display of absolute control. After it was all over, both film and story were circulated around Iraq so that the country would know exactly who was in charge.
This is when a real atmosphere of terror takes over in Iraq, and Saddam is the architect of that.
Now that Saddam was firmly in power in Baghdad, he was ready for a new challenge. His next ambition, to be the undisputed leader of the whole Gulf region. The major obstacle, neighboring Iran. In 1979, Saddam Hussein was on top of his world. He had just anointed himself president of Iraq, and he'd eliminated most of his Iraqi enemies, as well as some comrades.
He said himself that if I get suspicion about a person, I kill him. And it is very much better for me to be mistaken in killing a person than to mistake and letting him kill me.
Saddam was now ready to expand his power beyond Iraq's borders, to Iran. In September 1980, Saddam attacked his neighbor to the east. Saddam, the army commander-in-chief with no military experience, thought he would win the war in a matter of weeks. But the war did not go as he expected.
Iran was much larger than Iraq, 3 times nearly the population of Iraq. It was a formidable country.
The conflict turned into long, bloody trench warfare. While the ground war against Iran dragged on, Saddam was sinking billions into a secret program to develop a nuclear weapon. He felt the bomb would turn the tide against Iran and earned respect, or at least fear, from the rest of the world. The Israelis took him seriously, and in 1981 they launched a daring airstrike over hundreds of miles of desert to destroy Saddam's reactor at Osirek, near Baghdad. With his reactor destroyed and war casualties mounting, Saddam offered Iran a ceasefire in 1982. But the Ayatollah vowed to continue fighting until Saddam was out of power. Saddam turned to his cabinet for advice. His health minister suggested he step down temporarily to gain the ceasefire.
Saddam, as the story goes, thanked him for his candor and had him arrested on the spot. The minister's wife came to Saddam and pled with him, please return my husband to me. He promised her he would. As best as I can tell, this was one of the few promises he's ever kept. He returned her husband to her the next day in a black canvas body bag chopped into pieces.
Finally, on April 20th, 1988, with 500,000 casualties on each side, the Iranians agreed to a ceasefire. The border stood almost exactly where it had been when Saddam invaded 8 years earlier. But Saddam declared victory. The home front was in chaos, the streets filled with 1 million unemployed army veterans, and unrest rippled through the countryside. Within his own family, there was also unrest and violence. In 1988, Saddam, often pictured as a family man, took a mistress. Saddam's oldest son, Uday, was offended by the insult to his mother. One night, he vented his anger on Saddam's close friend and valet, and bludgeoned the valet to death. Fearing Saddam's wrath, Uday swallowed a fistful of sleeping pills and was rushed to the hospital.
At the hospital, Saddam and his bodyguards came into Uday's room where he had his stomach pumped. Saddam was hitting everyone in sight, even Uday, who was on his sickbed. He broke Uday's arm, imprisoned him for 45 days, tortured him, and put all of us in prison.
The family whisked Uday away to Switzerland until Saddam's temper cooled, and his son could return to Iraq 6 months later.
The economic and political promise of Iraq was wrecked in that decade. It lay in ruins.
All of his problems boiled down to one thing: money. Saddam knew he needed cash, lots of it, to survive. He began looking to the oil-rich Gulf state of Kuwait for his salvation. But his greed would lead him into a confrontation with the whole world. In 1990, Saddam's regime was deep in debt. The cost of the disastrous war against Iran had bankrupted him. And even Iraq's huge oil reserves could not bail him out. But what really annoyed Saddam was that his Gulf neighbors were not sufficiently grateful for his efforts to contain the Iranian threat, particularly Kuwait.
He needed a lot of money. The Iraqis believed that the Kuwaitis had $200 billion in various banks and assets. He felt that this could be a wonderful opportunity to make Iraq rich in one big presto, like presto, and we are becoming rich again.
Backed by the West, Kuwait stood firm. On July 24th, Saddam began moving thousands of troops toward the Kuwaiti border.
Iraq invaded and took over its tiny neighbor Kuwait today. That set off worldwide protest and drew sanctions from the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union.
It only took 6 hours on August 2nd, 1990, for Saddam's armies to occupy the tiny country. World condemnation of the invasion caught Saddam by surprise. The United Nations demanded that he withdraw from Kuwait and quickly imposed a boycott and sanctions.
This is not, as Saddam Hussein would have it, the United States against Iraq. It is Iraq against the world.
While his troops were looting and pillaging Kuwait, Saddam tried to use television to go on the offensive, with a series of bizarre photo ops seen round the world.
Are you getting your milk, Stuart?
He asked citizens of occupied Kuwait if they were glad to see him, and showed off his hospitality to what he called his Western guests in Iraq and Kuwait. The rest of the world called them hostages.
Iraq will not be permitted to annex Kuwait. And that's not a threat, it's not a boast, that's just the way it's going to be.
On November 29, 1990, the UN set a deadline of January 15, 1991, for Iraq's withdrawal from Kuwait. It authorized the use of force if Saddam did not comply. Within a week, Saddam released his Western hostages, but still he did not withdraw. Instead, he tried to make his case in the international media. He granted Dan Rather of CBS News a one-on-one interview as part of a campaign to make his point to the American public.
Kuwait is part of Iraq.
Forever?
We have said this. Kuwait is part of an Iraqi province.
والعراقيين مثل الأمريكان أيضا لا يريدون الحرب.
And the Iraqis, the people of Iraq, like the Americans, do not want the war to Iraq.
Just across the Saudi border, the UN coalition was assembling the largest military buildup since the Vietnam War. 500,000 troops, a fleet of hundreds of warplanes and thousands of tanks, were poised on the Kuwaiti border, ready to attack. On the eve of the UN deadline, Iraqi TV showed a defiant Saddam on the beach in Kuwait being cheered by his troops.
He thought that Bush wouldn't have the stomach. Bush had the stomach. He thought Bush wouldn't draw a line for him. Bush drew a line for him. He never thought that Bush would pull the trigger on him, and Bush pulled the trigger on him.
Within a matter of hours after the UN deadline, Operation Desert Storm broke in a wave of bombings on Baghdad, carried live on television around the world. Saddam was not prepared for the coalition barrage of cruise missiles, smart bombs, and other high-tech weapons.
This was a man who just lived in a bunker. He didn't really understand modern warfare. He had no idea of the kind of firepower that would be unleashed on him.
Saddam's only response was a barrage of Scud missiles, which he launched against Israel and Saudi Arabia, to no avail. Fire! On February 24th, the UN troops launched the Gulf War's massive ground offensive. It was a stunning victory. 100 hours after the start of the ground war, the UN troops liberated the tiny Gulf state of Kuwait. But Saddam Hussein was still at large.
Saddam was of the opinion that the United States had the technology to find him at any given moment of the night or day and was disposed to drop a bomb on him. And so he moved around all the time and slept in a different bed every night. But certainly he was a very nervous man.
By the logic that he lives by, you would never punch someone out and not finish him off. He must have thought that the Americans would be coming. They would be on the way.
But when UN generals met with Iraqis to accept their ceasefire, President Bush had made the decision that Allied troops would not go after Saddam and his Republican Guard. His decision would be controversial for years. For Saddam Hussein had survived again, and even in crushing defeat, now was able to claim a victory of sorts. He was down, but not out, and he still had plenty of fight left in him, as the West would soon learn. In 1991, Saddam Hussein had suffered one of modern history's most spectacular defeats in the Persian Gulf War. But he had no intention of giving up. The dust kicked up by his retreating troops had not yet settled when Hussein was back at war, this time to stay in power. Rebel Shiite Muslims in southern Iraq and Kurds in the north were making headway against his weakened forces. Yet within a few months, Saddam had crushed their challenge to his rule. Saddam continued his battle of wills against the rest of the world, taking on a new president, Bill Clinton, by violating the terms of the Gulf War ceasefire agreement.
Saddam was bound to test Bill Clinton. He wanted to because he wanted to see the full measure of the person, because that's bully psychology. That's thug psychology.
Clinton responded with a round of cruise missiles. And when Saddam backed a plot to assassinate former President Bush on a visit to Kuwait, Clinton ordered another round.
Saddam Hussein has shown the world before, with his acts of aggression and his weapons of mass destruction, that he cannot be trusted.
The UN sent inspectors to Iraq who found and destroyed huge stocks of weapons, including chemical and biological warheads, and even a supergun built to lob shells hundreds of miles toward Israel. The inspectors also discovered that Saddam was still at work developing a nuclear bomb.
Are you denying me access to the site?
I shall not answer you, I answer.
These discoveries justified keeping in place the economic sanctions leveled against Iraq, and while his people suffered the consequences, It seems Saddam couldn't have cared less.
His only political vision is to be a president of Iraq, not to serve the Iraqis, but to serve himself and his two sons. That is all. Whether the Iraqis die or not, that's not his concern.
Saddam established a smuggling ring that allowed him to maintain his personal wealth. Oil was sold on the black market, as were medical supplies originally designated for his people. Saddam used the revenues to build opulent new presidential palaces for himself. Meanwhile, his nation starved. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. As for any hint of opposition, it was silenced, quickly, brutally. The efficiency of Saddam's security ensured his political survival by eliminating any challenge, no matter how small.
Saddam Hussein, since he took power in 79, at least he killed 1,000 a month, at least. For people trying to say something bad about the government, something bad about Saddam, or complaining of that his policies.
Saddam once again attacked the Kurdish safe haven in northern Iraq. To punish him, the U.S. fired scores of cruise missiles at Iraqi missile sites. But Saddam continued to reign, and the attempts led by the United States to weaken his rule seemed increasingly futile.
You take your hand off my inspector now. I have instruction from my boss.
For all of the UN inspectors' efforts, they were never able to get a full accounting of Saddam's arsenal. It was believed that stockpiles of deadly biological weapons, including nerve gas and anthrax, still existed. The scenario became a familiar one. Saddam would kick out the arms inspectors. The United States would threaten to bomb Baghdad. Saddam would back down. This defiance continued to go unchallenged until George W. Bush was elected President of the United States in 2000.
His Excellency, Mr. George W. Bush,
the namesake and son of Saddam's old adversary, was determined to finish the job his father had begun.
We cannot stand by and do nothing while dangers gather. We must stand up for our security and for the permanent rights and the hopes of mankind. By heritage and by choice, the United States of America will make that stand.
Even as President Bush was lobbying Congress for war powers, a defiant Saddam ordered his foreign minister to swear Iraq was free of biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons, accusing George Bush and the United States of fabricating a crisis. In November, the United Nations Security Council passed a brand new and strongly worded resolution supporting U.S. efforts to confront Iraq.
Iraq must now, without delay or negotiations, fully disarm.
Faced with the growing threat of military action, Saddam conceded. Near the end of 2002, he let arms inspectors back into Iraq. But once again, the inspection process appeared to be hindered by Saddam's manipulation of the UN. In January 2003, Chief UN Weapons Inspector Hans Blix issued a sharply worded indictment of Iraq's reluctance to disarm. Hussein's defiance prompted President Bush to throw down the gauntlet. On March 17th, President Bush gave Saddam a final ultimatum.
All the decades of deceit and cruelty have now reached an end. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict.
2 days later, the Second Gulf War began. The regime of the Butcher of Baghdad seemed, at last, to be facing its final days. On March 20th, 2003, just hours before the United States imposed deadline for Saddam Hussein to give up power, President Bush received stunning news. An Iraqi official had turned on Saddam, and U.S. intelligence sources had an exact fix on where he would be that night.
there's only a select few people around Saddam Hussein that know his whereabouts. So what that indicates is the Americans have managed to penetrate one of the hardest to penetrate security units in Iraq.
President Bush ordered airstrikes on the bunker in southern Baghdad. Within hours, dozens of cruise missiles and 4 2,000-pound bombs pummeled the site. But later, an exhaustive search turned up no evidence that Saddam had been hit.
He has a certain animal cunning, there's no doubt about it. He has survived a number of assassination attempts.
Saddam eluded at least 2 more direct attempts on his life by United States forces. But his military was clearly no match for the coalition. Just 3 weeks into the war, tanks rolled into Baghdad. On April 9th, the city fell, along with dozens of statues of Saddam Hussein. His tortuous reign had come to an end. But what had become of him?
I don't know the whereabouts of Saddam Hussein. I don't know if he's dead or alive. I do know he's no longer in power.
The hunt for Saddam and his ruthless sons Uday and Qusay intensified. They topped the list of the most wanted Iraqis. In the deck of cards issued to soldiers, Saddam was the ace of spades.
It's well understood by U.S. force commanders in Iraq that we have to find the man. Either we capture him or we kill him. Or if he's already dead, we have to find the body.
The United States stepped up the pressure, offering a $25 million reward for information leading to the capture or killing of Saddam, $15 million for each of his sons.
Most likely, rather than good intelligence or investigative work, it'll, if Saddam is caught or killed, it'll be on the basis of some individual walking in and providing us with a tip-off as to where he is.
That's exactly what led U.S. forces to Uday and Qusay. In mid-July, an Iraqi walked into a military field office in the northern city of Mosul and told officials where they could find Saddam's reviled sons.
The home where Uday and Qusay were holed up, along with 2 other individuals, was in the home of a cousin of Saddam Hussein.
The next morning, U.S. forces assaulted the villa and were immediately met with gunfire, wounding 4 soldiers. Reinforcements were called in, and a fierce 6-hour battle followed.
They fought back hard. They had a lot of ammunition. They had some AK-47s. The building's very solid.
When the dust settled, there were 4 dead inside the house. Uday, Qusay, 1 bodyguard, and Qusay's 14-year-old son, Mustafa. Saddam Hussein's inner circle was getting smaller and smaller. Yet the deposed dictator remained at large. Months passed, and in spite of millions in reward money, he was able to elude his pursuers. Still, the hunters remained hopeful.
He's essentially a man hiding in the rubble of his country and with a price on his head, with a large and effective army searching for him, a joint task force with all kinds of really effective commandos and intelligence people searching for him every day. I'd bet quite a lot of my own money on the fact that we'd get him.
Meanwhile, there were daily attacks on American troops, along with random acts of terror, causing havoc in the effort to bring peace and order to Iraq. Some wondered if Saddam was behind the campaign of violence. It was reported that Saddam moved frequently from one safe house to another, protected by loyalists from his tribal homeland around Tikrit. Officials believe he never stayed in one place for more than a few hours, frustrating the intensive search in that area. It seemed that the earth had swallowed him up.
What we realized early on in the summer is that we believed the people we had to get to were the mid-level individuals, his bodyguards and other people. And so we tried to work through family and tribal ties that might have been close to Saddam Hussein.
A detainee, during interrogation, told American forces to go to the town of Adwar, 9 miles from Tikrit.
It just takes finding the right person who will give you a good idea where he might be. And that's what happened.
On December 13th at around 8:30 p.m. Baghdad time, 600 U.S. troops moved in on a small farm in Adwar in an operation called Red Dawn. There was a mud hut on the property. On the floor inside, there was a styrofoam plug covering dirt and a rug. Underneath was a narrow hole 8 feet deep. In the small space at the bottom was Iraq's former dictator, Saddam Hussein.
And he was in the bottom of a hole, so there's no way he could fight back, so he was just caught like a rat.
Saddam had a pistol and 2 AK-47 rifles, but he did not resist the soldiers, and there were no injuries or casualties in the raid. The captured tyrant also had in his possession $750,000 US, but the money was of no use to him now. He was taken to an undisclosed location for positive ID. A combination of scars, a tattoo, and DNA convinced U.S. authorities they had the right man in custody.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
There was an emotional outburst from Iraqis at the press conference who chanted death to Saddam, and the streets of Baghdad came alive with celebratory gunfire. President George Bush had a more measured response.
In the history of Iraq, a dark and painful era is over. A hopeful day has arrived. All Iraqis can now come together and reject violence and build a new Iraq.
It was hard to believe that the bearded, bedraggled man who had terrorized Iraq for 30 years was now at the mercy of his captors. The arrogance that had characterized his persona was nowhere to be seen.
He was a tired man, and also, I think, a man resigned to his fate.
What Saddam's ultimate fate will be may not be known for some time, but one thing is clear. The people of Iraq will never have to face another day wondering if Saddam will come back to torment them. Their long nightmare is over.
With Iraq still at a major crossroads in its struggle towards democracy, U.S. forces handed the captive Saddam Hussein to Iraq, placing the fate of its former dictator in the hands of the people he once ruled.
Saddam will be entitled to have a representation. We assure you that it will be a just trial and a fair trial, unlike the trials that he inflicted on the Iraqi people.
Brought before an Iraqi tribunal, Saddam bore little resemblance to the broken and disheveled man captured in December 2003. He is charged with a litany of war crimes, including the killings in Dujai in 1982, part of a bloody retaliation to a failed assassination attempt. His court hearing is set for autumn 2005. International debate has risen over speculations that Saddam could face the death penalty. The world has watched and listened to this captive tyrant. Even his favorite snack foods are well documented. But Saddam Hussein is facing his day in court, and his history of tyrannical oppression gives a bleak ending to the legacy he worked so hard to preserve.
On the next Dead Famous, oh my God, Gail and Chris try to raise the ghost of Jim Morrison.
That was cool.
If Chris gets Mr. Mojo rising,
is there anybody here that can help us?
Will Gail run away from the truth?
I'm very nervous and I'm not happy.
Jim Morrison, Dead Famous, Tuesday at 10, only on the Biography Channel.